Hello, everyone. I want to talk to you guys about something that, to me, really deserves our attention, and that is the fact that for the first time since this war began, the Polish government is finally confronting Ukraine on its Nazism. Now, years prior to this conflict, the Poles talked about Ukraine's Nazi problem all the time. I remember back in 2019 hearing about how the Poles were very upset about the fact that Ukrainians deny that there was a huge massacre of ethnic Poles done by Ukrainian nationalists. And this was a point of contention and friction between the neighboring countries. Then this war commenced. Russia, as we all know, back in February of 2022, last year, right? Last year, Russia invaded Ukraine. We all know this. All of a sudden, Poland very quickly changed its tune in regards to Ukraine. The Poles, out of all of the European nations, were probably the most expressive about their sympathies to Ukraine. And they absorbed most of the Ukrainian refugees. Checking the mic, because you never know. These things happen. But now, the Prime Minister of Poland, Mateusz Morawiecki, just recently said that not only will Poland not tolerate Ukraine's glorification of Stepan Bandera and the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which was an ultranationalist Ukrainian organization that collaborated with the Nazis, but that he himself will confront the Prime Minister of Ukraine about Ukraine's cult of Bandera. And I want to read to you guys an excerpt from a Polish article that came out today. This was published by Polskie Radio 24. And it says, this is a quote from the Prime Minister of Poland, Mateusz Morawiecki. He says, "We are extremely critical of any glorification of Stepan Bandera." And this is great. I love this. I love to see Poland even though, yes, Ukraine is in the middle of a war with Russia. Yes, Ukraine was invaded and all these things. Even though all these things have happened and are happening, I'm glad to see a high-ranking Polish official confront Ukraine on this issue because it's sincere. Because before this war, the Poles were confronting the Ukrainians. They went hush-hush about it during the beginning of the conflict and the middle of the conflict, and now finally they're talking about it again. And Morawiecki says here, in the next conversation with the Prime Minister of Ukraine, Denis Shmyhal, "I will say this very, very clearly," announced Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki when asked about the commemoration of Stepan Bandera by the Ukrainian parliament. And this article says, on Sunday, on the 114th anniversary of Stepan Bandera's birth, the Supreme Council of Ukraine, the Parliament of Ukraine, published on Twitter a photo of the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army, General Valery Zaluzhny, under the portrait of the UPA leader, and quoted several quotes from books written by Bandera. And just to remind you guys, General Valery Zaluzhny, he is the guy who recently said that killing Russians for him is like a religion. And he is also a big supporter of Azov. In fact, he had Dmitry Yarosh as his advisor not too long ago. And that's quite significant because Dmitry Yarosh was once the leader of Right Sector, which is a neo-Nazi, far-right Ukrainian military group, a fighting group. They are a paramilitary group. And I think eventually right sector got embedded into the Ukrainian military. And so I'm glad to see that Morawiecki himself is now saying that he will confront the Prime Minister of Ukraine on this issue. And it puts here a quote from Morawiecki in which he says, "There is no nuance here. If Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, resembles this figure who was the ideologist of those criminal times, war times, let us remind you that all this happened under the German occupation, these terrible Ukrainian crimes. It is also worth reminding about it. In the slightest to a large extent, it is impossible to agree to any leniency for those who do not want to admit that that terrible genocide was something unimaginable, and to make a full expiation, a full admission of guilt," said the head of the government. This is great. Ukraine needs to be confronted on this issue. I don't like the idea of America supporting a country that has a culture of Nazism, has a cult of personality for a Nazi collaborator, and really a sick bastard. Stepan Bandera was a sick bastard. I was reading about him earlier today, and I did not know this until today. Stepan Bandera liked strangling cats. No one really says this, okay? This has been rarely spoken of. There's been some articles written on the subject, but you can look this up yourself. Stepan Bandera enjoyed strangling cats, okay? He enjoyed strangling cats because he was a sadist. He was a sadist, and he believed that by strangling cats, he could show his power. He could show how willing he was to go deep into the depths of cruelty. And he liked the idea of disturbing people around him. This is what I read. He would strangle cats, and people that knew him would see that and say, "Oh, this guy's crazy." And they would be disturbed by that. And he got pleasure out of disturbing people by strangling cats. That's serial killer behavior. Yet this is the biggest hero in Ukraine, or at least definitely one of the highest heroes held in Ukrainian culture, especially in Western Ukrainian culture. The fact that the Ukrainian government made it law that people within Ukraine cannot really write history that criticizes the OUN, that criticizes Stepan Bandera. All of these things, the fact that they made his birthday a national holiday, I mean, all of these things show us that there is a culture of Nazism. And this is why when people say things like, "Oh, you know, they are Nazis in Russia," well, guess what? They're Nazis in America, too. They're Nazis in Great Britain. They're Nazis in... probably you can go to some African country and you can find some neo-Nazis there. We're not talking about individuals who are neo-Nazis. We're talking about a culture of Nazism that exists, a culture of ultranationalism that exists, and Ukraine definitely has this. And when you go into, and Morawiecki he pointed to something that is very true. He talked about how we cannot deny the fact that what the OUN did, what Bandera's people did, was unimaginable. And I'll read to you guys the quote again. He says here, "It is impossible to agree to any leniency for those who do not want to admit that that terrible genocide was something unimaginable." And it truly was something unimaginable. When you read about what the Ukrainians did to Polish people in the 1940s, it was unfathomable for any decent human being. And I don't have to get into the details. We're talking eviscerating pregnant women, skinning people alive. I mean, really, really demonic stuff, satanic stuff. It's like the demons from hell were released. They were unfettered, and they, like a storm, like a horrendous torrent, overtook that part of Europe. And around 100,000 or so Polish people were murdered. And what's so disturbing, and this goes into the whole Cold War culture. What's so disturbing is that the mastermind behind this massacre was not Bandera. Bandera played a role. I mean, he was one of the biggest leaders in the OUN. He was very influential. He was one of the leaders of rebellion against Polish occupation, because the Ukrainian nationalists who were killing Poles, they were living under Polish occupation until the Germans came. And the mastermind, the biggest orchestrator behind this slaughterhouse was Mykola Lebed. Mykola Lebed was allowed entry into the United States, and he was given a position as a Cold War propagandist for Ukrainian expats. This is a guy who murdered 100,000 people. We put Ted Bundy to death for murdering 20 women. Some guy murders 100,000 people and we give him a job. And that's what America did. America gave this man a job, put him in the board of directors of some Ukrainian nonprofit, really a Ukrainian nationalist organization masquerading itself as a nonprofit. And basically, they used Lebed to come out almost like a Solzhenitsyn. You know, oh look, poor us, we were persecuted by the evil Soviets, and yada yada yada. And the reality is that thousands of these Ukrainian Nazis were allowed entry into North America and also into Great Britain. There was a horrific massacre that was done, and this is just one of the there were many massacres that were done by these monsters, but this is just one of the massacres, the massacre of Huta Pieniaka. Huta Pieniaka was a small village, had a population between 500 to 1,200 people. The entire village was massacred. The village lied near the Polish-Ukrainian border. Ukrainian nationalists went into this village and butchered almost everybody. Only about 3 people survived. I believe it was a woman and 2 children, and they survived because they pretty much played dead. After the people were butchered, the Ukrainians would loot the town, and the town was never inhabited ever again. Probably because people thought that it was cursed because of what happened there. The town has never been rebuilt. The only thing that you can see in Huta Pieniaka is a memorial. And Huta Pieniaka, the location of this town, is in Ukraine now. It's in Ukraine now. And the Poles went over there and they built a little memorial, and the Ukrainians destroyed it. The Poles came back and they rebuilt it, and it's still there. The fact that the Ukrainians were so resistant to a memorial tells me something about Ukraine. Tells me about the evil nationalist cult that is deeply ingrained in that country. And there were people involved in massacres like Huta Pieniaka who were allowed entry into Great Britain. And I'm going to read to you guys an excerpt from the Wikipedia page on Huta Pieniaka. And it says here, in the late 1940s, some 8,000 soldiers of the SS Galician, these were the Ukrainian Nazis, the SS Galician division, were allowed to come to Britain, allegedly including members of the unit that massacred inhabitants of Huta Pieniaka. And I want to read to you guys something else. The Soviet Union. Soviet soldiers apprehended hundreds of these Ukrainian Nazis who were involved in the extermination of the town of Huta Pieniaka, and the Soviets executed them. Why did the Soviets execute them? Because they killed those people in Huta Pieniaka. For your massacre of these Polish people, you are going to be executed. Fair justice. Fair justice. And what's interesting is that Poland knows this history, but for a long time, Poland has been very, very pro-Ukraine. This is changing, as you can see. But nonetheless, it's very disturbing, the hypocrisy. You know about the crimes that Ukraine committed. You know about the vicious nationalist culture, yet you will go out of your way to support Ukraine. And it reminds me of Israel. Israel, we all know about Israel. Israel was founded as a beacon of refuge for Jewish people, and rightfully so, understandably so, given the fact that the Jews went through the Holocaust. And the Israeli government knows about the far-right problem in Ukraine. And there's an article here, and this is amazing, because back in the day, right, before Russia invaded Ukraine, all these big major media publications were talking about, the far right in Ukraine and how dangerous it was. Here's an article from Foreign Policy from 2016, written by Benjamin Cohen. And look what it says here. And it talks about how the Israeli government confronted Ukraine on its Nazi problem. And it says here, many in Ukraine don't want to hear about their heroes' participation in the Holocaust, but Israel's President Rivlin didn't shy away from the truth. When Israel confronted Ukraine on its Nazi problem back in 2016, people supported Israel on that. Now you see Israel literally supporting Azov. Look what this article says. Earlier this week, the president of Israel gave a speech in Kiev that discussed Ukrainians' participation in the Holocaust. Ukrainian nationalists were not amused. Reuven Rivlin made his remarks at a session of the Ukrainian parliament commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Babi Yar massacre, when Nazi invaders slaughtered 33,771 Jews in a Kiev ravine from September 29th to the 30th, 1941. The lawmakers who invited him to speak may have expected him to dwell on the crimes committed against Ukrainian Jews by Germans, but Rivlin chose to also address the actions of Ukrainian collaborators who assisted the Nazis in mass murder. Rivlin's remarks came at a moment when Ukrainians are engaged in intense reflection about their national identity. The Euromaidan revolution of 2 years ago, the loss of Crimea, and the continuing war with Russia have heightened nationalist feelings, leading to a renewed veneration of 20th century nationalist groups. Now, isn't it interesting how this article says, look, Ukraine is returning back to these ultra-nationalist cults of personality. And it's saying that Israel is right to confront Ukraine on this issue, regardless of the fact that at this time there was a civil war going on in eastern Ukraine between the Ukrainian government and pro-Russian separatists. So even though there was a war happening, in which you had Russian proxies fighting against the Ukrainian government, the Israelis still confronted the Ukrainians on this issue. And here is an article from Foreign Policy saying, yes, Israel is right. And it says here, and if it doesn't honestly reckon with its past, Ukraine is in danger of enshrining a mirror image of the history-blind chauvinism that predominates in neighboring Russia. So it's even saying, look, if Ukraine doesn't learn from history, it's going to become bad. Well, the nationalism is still there in Ukraine. But there's no Nazis in Ukraine. And we should be saying all in unison, Slava Ukraine. It's totally insane. It's totally insane. But I'm glad to see the Polish government confronting Ukraine on this issue. I hope that it continues with this. I hope that it intensifies this, because the truth needs to get out there. And Poland was the biggest victim of Ukrainian nationalism. This is why I keep bringing up Poland. I keep bringing up Poland because we're supporting Ukrainian nationalism. And we see Poland very much so supporting Ukraine, although for geopolitical reasons. And Poland was the biggest victim of Ukrainian nationalism. We keep hearing about how history repeats. History repeats for those who do not learn from it. Well, why the hell are we supporting a historical monster if we truly believe that history repeats? Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.